Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and apologies for the delay. This is the 5th research seminar in our series at the Martin Center this term. I'm Jerry, and I'm one of the co-conveners of the seminar series along with Hamida, Michael, and Sam. Many of you have heard our speaker introduce himself at the start of each episode of his podcast, Scaffold, but today it's my pleasure to introduce Matthew Blunderfield. Matthew Blunderfield is a photographer and host of the podcast Scaffold, an interview history of contemporary architecture. His photographs have appeared in the Architect's Journal, Superposition Magazine, and the Architectural Review, and have recently featured in At Home in London, The Mansion Block, a book-length study co-published by the Architecture Foundation and MACK. Born in Vancouver, Matthew studied English literature at the University of British Columbia and architecture at the University of Toronto, before completing his RBA Part 3 at the Bartlett UCL. He teaches at the Royal College of Art and is a producer at the Architecture Foundation. His talk today is titled When Attitudes Become Form. After Matthew speaks today, we'll have some time for questions if Matthew's okay with that. If you're joining us on the live stream, do feel free to send us questions using the chat or Q&A function. And please join me in giving Matthew a warm welcome to Cambridge.
Thank you, Jerry. This is a much less intense situation than I was expecting. I'm kind of glad it's a gentle and quiet group of people here. Thanks for inviting me to give this talk. Thanks to the Martin Center as well. It's a really, should I do this? Okay, actually, I got it. It's a really strange experience for me to be talking about my work as an interviewer, because my work is really interrogating other people's work and trying to find the themes or emerging threads that define a practice. And I have to admit, it's kind of a challenge to kind of look inward and try and do the same with what I'm doing. So I think today will be a kind of struggle to articulate something about this interview project and about the work I do more broadly, especially around teaching. And I guess the other thing to note is it would be great if, as I'm speaking, you start to think about questions you might want to ask me, because I find I do better, obviously, in dialogue, and given the title of this series, Forms of Dialogue, why not honor that? So, yeah, so I think for me, there's this real interest in form generally. I mean, I studied English literature before I studied architecture. But I've always been really intrigued by the idea of form, and architecture as a formal project, obviously, but even literature as having a kind of formal component to it. And I think now more than ever, there's a real suspicion or anxiety or question about the value of form anymore, or the role of form in architectural practice, as architects are increasingly becoming much more social practitioners or environmental practitioners, coordinators of groups of people, coordinators of flows of material, administrators and bureaucrats. I feel like there's a kind of diminishment of the role of form in practice now. And that's why I chose the title. I think it kind of resonates with the series as well, Forms of Dialogue. So I think this is something I want to explore with you over the next half hour or so, the role of form in contemporary practice, and finding some examples of how to recover it or how to approach it differently than we might be doing now. It's also borrowing the title of an exhibition by this Swiss curator named Harold Zeman, who also exhibited an art show in the 1960s at the Kunsthalle in Bern called Live in Your Head, When Attitudes Become Form. And Zeman was trying to show everything that we had not yet seen, everything that came after, in his case, in the time he was working, hot art and minimal art, without any real criteria or choice. And it was kind of a first impression of something new or something different that was challenging the conventions of art practice at the time. And I think there's a lot of promise or potential or possibility when we kind of consider this phrase, when attitudes become form. I think there's some possibility for taking the same kind of rigor and interest and curiosity to contemporary architectural practice. So to begin, I think at the beginning, it might be helpful for me to introduce myself a little more. I'm from Vancouver. I grew up in Vancouver and left in my early 20s. And I think we were all steeped in a certain context, or we all are kind of introduced to certain influences early on in life. And I wanted to begin by sharing with you some of the influences on the way I think about art and architecture. And they all seem to kind of stem from this place, Vancouver, which is in the west coast of Canada, and is known colloquially as the terminal city. So it's kind of where the railroad ends, and it's where the new world ends in a way. It's only just over 100 years old. And I think for that reason, history becomes a very malleable thing, especially on the West Coast, where everything's up for interpretation, everything's up for grabs and available to be played with in a way or experimented with. So this is one of my favorite photographers, Jeff Wall, who often will stage photographs with amateur models, but very rigorously, scrupulously referencing certain art historical images. And this is Brian Youngin. He's a sculptor, an indigenous sculptor, who works primarily with these kind of mass-produced commercial objects, especially early on in his career with Nike Air Jordans. And what he'd do is he'd take this thing that existed as a commercial product and start to dismantle it and recombine it into what I think is a very ironic and possibly kind of cynical representation of an indigenous object. So he has hundreds of these masks that he's made out of Nike shoes. And again, there's something there that is about the kind of approach to history, an approach to kind of critique that is much more flexible and free, and can allow us to think about a very deep pasts, kind of oral histories and unrecorded histories, the kind of deep past of, in this case, North America and the West Coast, the indigenous histories, through a very, very strange and unconventional way that gives you some traction and ability to talk about the ways that culture can be co-opted, for example, or commercialized or capitalized upon. These are some objects by the artist Douglas Copeland. And I grew up in the same suburb that he did, but 30 years apart. And in addition to being a sculptor, he's also a novelist and a kind of public intellectual in a way. And again, he'll often use trash, the kind of flotsam of everyday life, but particular to his environment. So whether it's kind of plastic containers or buoys or otherwise, and he'll use them as a kind of basis for these sculptural manipulations to produce a kind of abstract expression out of what's around him. He's also really interested in cities. He had this installation at the CCA in Montreal called Super City about a decade ago. And he is a kind of futurist as well. And the reason I'm introducing you or sharing with you a figure like Copeland is that he really embodies this versatility and agility when it comes to making cultural work that he can operate in these different categories of practice, from fine art to fiction to criticism, and everything in between. And somehow that's all up for grabs. And I think the reason I'm sharing these examples with you, these figures with you, is to, I guess, remind myself of my attraction to the work, but also to share with you the kind of openness possibilities in artistic and architectural practice, that there's a kind of expanded realm of possibility in the work of these kinds of people. So Copeland's also written a kind of portrait of Vancouver, which I'm very fond of. And it's a great example of another way of writing about urban space that goes beyond the kind of conventions of architectural writing, you could say. And he's probably best known for this book, Generation X, which is his first work of fiction, and really coined the term and identified his generation, and brought me as a young person into this awareness of what zeitgeist was, what it meant to be living in a particular moment, and what it means to start to identify the signifiers of the present, or what you could call the extreme present, which is a topic that Copeland is very interested in. I think as architects, we are also there in a way. We're also very curious about what it means to be alive right now, and what it means to make work that responds to the contemporary condition we found ourselves in. So again, I feel like Copeland can sort of help us ask those questions. And then finally, there's this poet, Lisa Robertson, who's from Toronto originally, but spent the earlier part of her creative career in Vancouver. And there's a book by her called Occasional Work and 7 Walks from the Office for Soft Architecture. And she'd be in Vancouver in the 80s, wandering the streets and writing poetry about the city. And it sounds kind of quaint and naive. I don't know why I'm self-conscious about that, but I feel like there isn't a lot of discussion around the role of poetry today. It seems to have been cast aside as superfluous or indulgent or irrelevant. But in fact, Robertson's work is very activist and very galvanizing, and can kind of, I think, motivate a really critical response to the changing shape of the city. And what she's done with this book is become a kind of modern day or latter day Eugene Atget. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this photographer, but he was working in Paris in the 1880s as Haussmann was redeveloping that city. And during that period of massive upheaval, of which Robertson was seeing a kind of correlation with the changes in Vancouver at the time, he was frantically capturing the interiors of Parisian apartments before they were demolished for posterity, but also as an act of opposition or defiance to the way things were going. And I think Robertson's work is the same. It's capturing a particular moment in the city as it continues to evolve. So there's a kind of fieldwork component to the observational work of the poet and the photographer, and I'd like to argue the work of the interviewer as well. So I studied English literature, then I went into architecture, I went to U of T in Toronto. And I just thought it'd be interesting to show you the kind of work I was doing there briefly, as you're kind of totally immersed in your projects right now, and I think quite near the end of the term as well. But I found myself becoming quite resistant to architecture as I was designing it. And you can see here, like the building I'm working with is actually totally erased. And what I'm showing are people congregating or gathering or acting in various ways in the city. And I think I took so much more pleasure in civic life and private life and the imagination of that experience than I did in the actual building itself. To the extent that for this project, which is also set in Vancouver, on the downtown east side, in this really contested, rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, started to produce profiles of imagined users of the scheme based on research I'd done, journalism that had already been produced in the area, and then primary kind of source material as well that I gathered. So I think this is kind of giving us maybe a clue about my interests or my tendencies, which are kind of veering towards the social, the biographical, but somehow set in architecture. And before I move on, I think it's just worth, before we end this chapter about this transition from English literature to architecture and then on to something else, there's this interesting term, there's no slide for it, but it's a useful one to keep in mind, which has to do with the way of interpreting literature that I was introduced to as I was studying it. And it's called the affective fallacy, which is basically a critique from a kind of school of criticism that was wary of the reader bringing their experience of the text to bear in their critique of it. So if I can try and articulate that more clearly. Yeah, it's this concept that's an answer to the idea of impressionistic criticism, which argues that the reader's response to a poem is the ultimate indication of its value. So there's a real wariness in criticism or interpretation of bringing the reader's response to the material. And I had this one professor who, for a whole term, encouraged the students to do precisely that, to be conscious as you're reading of your response to the text and to interpret the text almost beyond the presence of the author and instead between yourself and the work, not the author, but the work. And that really stuck with me as a way of interpreting anything, actually. But it seems particularly relevant when we talk about the interpretation of architecture, because ultimately, in not too long a period of time, the architect is completely invisible, and all you're left with is the object. And so it seems like a relevant kind of framework through which to understand the creative work of architecture, but one understandably at odds with the way we think about criticism now. Okay, so I've always loved interviews, and there are lots of different radio hosts and programs I could tell you about, but by far my favorite is this program called Bookworm, which is based in Santa Monica and hosted by KCRW. And this is Michael Silverblatt, who is the host of the show and has been for the past 27 years, I think. And I would listen to this show almost religiously. So I think Michael has really imprinted on me in a very strange way. And I think he's a good example of this affective fallacy at play. So what he will do with all of his guests, and he's interviewed thousands of novelists over the past 3 decades, is read everything they've written before he speaks to them. And he'll even sometimes listen to the music he knows they listen to as they write. And there's this really extreme and freakish degree of preparation that really comes through in the kind of conversations he has. Because what it does is he will often be able to, in the dialogues with writers that he has, expose something about their work that they weren't yet aware of. And I find that always so exciting when it happens in a conversation, that it's something quite alive and volatile, much like this lecture, which I prepared for, I assure you, but I'm not able to kind of script things. And I think the way Silverblatt works is the same. And he refers to this as being the real thing. When you're in this moment of thinking together with a guest, at the same time as an architect, my my relationship to architecture became incredibly superficial, where it's mostly about the image, and not the image that you sit with and contemplate, but the image that you rapidly consume and scroll away from. And this kind of insatiable lust for something stimulating, something novel, something different. And so at some point, I was practicing architecture in London. I was just realizing I was missing this kind of intensity of engagement with architecture that I saw people like Silverblatt producing in other disciplines, and decided that I would just do it myself. I would give it a shot and start to call up or email architects and artists and designers whose work I wanted to have a deeper relationship to. And I mean, in this theme of field work, you could think of it as something equivalent to Ron and Judy Lomax's project, recording folk music across the United States. But equally, Studs Terkel, these are interesting names to me, and they might be interesting to you. A kind of anthropologist of everyday life who would interview, there's a book called Work, which is just hundreds of people being interviewed by Terkel about their jobs. And there's something incredibly banal about it, but also very urgent in terms of recording, again, the present moment. And I feel like there is this urgency with architecture as well to take note of what's happening in a way that goes beyond the kind of streaming clickbait world we become too accustomed to. And then this is a little strange, but you have to bear with me. I think when you think more about the contemporary moment, this present moment, and the role of the archival project of recording conversations, it makes me think about the way that people conceptualize history. This is a painting from Paul Klee from the 1920s called Angelus Novus. And it's a painting that the cultural theorist Walter Benjamin was really attracted to and used as a kind of symbol of his ideas about history. So he's called this, in retrospect, the angel of history. And I'll just read briefly what he said about it. So the angel's face is turned towards the past, and I'll just paraphrase it because it's a bit too much. The angel's looking towards the past, and what the angel sees is this mounting wreckage of history. And at the same time, there's this storm of progress blowing the angel away towards the future, but the angel's eyes are not looking forward. And it's this really haunting, beautiful representation of the experience of being alive right now, I think, being in this contemporary moment. And it's a kind of melancholic view of history as well. But I find it really exciting to just be conscious of that, that relationship we have to time and to history as it's being produced before us. So basically, any encounter we have, any conversation we have becomes a part of this historical wreckage. And I think that the interviews certainly do as well. And another kind of thinker, historian, architectural critic who's also drawn to this idea of history is Kenneth Frampton, who'll be speaking, I think, next week, closing out this series. And I think it's probably worth reminding us a bit of, if not Frampton, then his tendencies as well, which are also very embedded in conversation. So there's this essay by Kurt Forster, who was a contemporary of Kenneth's, called The Birth of Architecture from the Spirit of Conversation. And I think instead of reading it to you now, I'll read it at the end because I think it probably goes better. But I think the point of bringing it up here and bringing up Frampton is to say that there is this real excitement around understanding the contemporary and understanding the historical project of architecture through this particular lens. So what am I doing? What is this interview project about? I think it's a kind of similar attitude again. And if you look at the list of the people I've spoken with over the past 6 years now, it becomes a kind of historical document of contemporary architecture and contemporary practice. And I mean, I've spoken not only with architects, but with artists, visual artists, performance artists, poets, landscape artists, or sorry, landscape architects rather, psychotherapists in some cases, writers, curators. And I think the reason I've been compelled to do this is because thinking back to people like Copeland, and indeed there are many more examples of this, architecture really does exist in this expanded field. And it's impossible to understand it without understanding all of its adjacencies. And so to me, there are these protagonists outside of architecture that work in parallel with it or in tandem with it, whose ideas and whose practices are still profoundly relevant to understanding contemporary architecture. And what I wanted to do now was bring us all closer to just a few of these conversations I've had, ones that seem to align with the topic of the lecture. How are we doing for time? We've got like 15 minutes left. So, yeah, responding to this question of form and architecture and how it might be kind of reconsidered or recovered in some way. So this is Apparata, and Nick and Esther, and I visited their project in Barking not too long ago, a house for artists. And what was so exciting about this visit and about seeing this project in particular were the ideas that it kind of called forth around the importance of design in a way, the importance of dimensions even, or proportions. So this is the main loggia off which people access their flats. And something that Nick said while we were kind of, I think we'd sat down by that point in the living room to talk more about the project. He was saying that what we're always trying to do is a kind of activism, but the activism is entirely expressed and developed through prosaic things. Literally, where is the door? How wide is the walkway? That kind of stuff. It's not either or. Either architecture is its own autonomous discipline, or it's a social practice. There has to be room for the idea that the actual devices you use to engage with activist work can literally be construction, space, and architecture. And I mean, looking at the plan, it's really true that it's through designing this plan in a very specific way that certain social possibilities emerge. So we walked up the stairs. This is a typical upper floor plan. And we paused on this landing for a moment. And they were telling me how it's not uncommon for residents to take tables out there in the summer and have dinner together, which is the most unusual thing to imagine going on a lift lobby. But that's essentially what this is. And then similarly, the main kind of loggia becomes an open living room for all the flats. Then there's a second route, which is 750 mil wide, that brings you to the back door, essentially, which is the door to your bedroom. There's a low gate, and there's a certain amount of trust among residents that you won't use it unless it's necessary. You won't kind of encroach on people's privacy unless there's some kind of understanding. And I think stuff like this is so exciting to me because it's so real in a way, but it's also profoundly social. And it is a kind of activist gesture as well. And that's something I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts about, because my sense is that these two motivations are becoming increasingly unmoored from each other. I mean, similarly, this is a project for a library by Apparata. And in response to this project, which is a public library, they've explained that you can make public spaces on a budget, and you can do that with architecture as the primary driver. The primary generator is not going to be an image of cheapness or haste. It's going to be architecture as a social art. And again, this really inspires me, or gives me a lot of hope or a sense of promise around the potential of architecture, the practice of architecture. I'm just going to talk really briefly about a few other practices that, again, are relevant to this topic of this relationship between attitude and form. So this is Sam Chermayev, who I've interviewed in Berlin. He's from New York originally and practiced in Tokyo before moving to Berlin to set up his office. And this picture on the left is so important to me, actually. I was in Ghent with students a couple of years ago, and one of them, Nori, passed me a book on Sam's work. And it opened to this page, which was of Sam and a couple of his friends on a rooftop, just emerging from this sauna he'd designed. And I had no context for the image at all. I didn't know anything about Sam's practice either. But to me, on first glance, it looked like a post-apocalyptic setting. It looked like the world had just ended. And yet people were finding ways of being comfortable in it. And it was so moving and so uplifting, but also melancholic. And there was a kind of feeling in this picture that is what drew me to speak with Sam. And he also designs buildings. So he works at different scales, from the industrial object to the architectural project. But he's always interested in this kind of interference and this sense of kind of making do in a way, but in a way that affords you so much more pleasure and delight and sort of social exchange as well. So talking about his work, Sam said that the success of all interiors are specifics, specific wobbles, specific things in the way, specific dirt behind the ears of a house. It's wildly inefficient. It's a wildly inefficient way of designing. It can drive people crazy. But the notion that you can provide this joyous instability for people, I want to offer that to everyone. And it's true that his work is profoundly unstable and often involves this kind of exquisite corpse of different programs. He's been inspired by the furniture makers Mueller van Severen, who often kind of merge a bookshelf with a chair or a bed with a table. And he's doing much the same with these found objects in a way. And there's a kind of friction in the architecture too. Like, I don't have a section of the building on the right, which is in Kufustrasse and where Sam's office is based. But the floor plates are kind of zippering into each other. And when you're inside a flat, there's a volume of your neighbor's apartment, usually their bedroom, overhanging you. And the wall is soft, so there's a possibility, if you want, of connecting your mezzanine to their bedroom or buying their bedroom and then sealing it. Like, there's a kind of ambiguity around the domain of the tenant, which again points to this kind of joyous instability that Sam was talking about. And then I think with Sam's work as well, and this goes back to the sauna on a roof, there's a kind of hedonism at play. But again, it's always working with what's available. And I pushed Sam, obviously, on his, in a way, his inheritance, or the fact that he's quite comfortable financially, let's say. He knows people with nice cars. But what he's done is he's convinced them to lend him those cars and make projects out of them. So in this case, he worked with the fashion designers Bless to completely fit out the car interior and this kind of beaded wood material, which you often see on the backs of car seats to stop the sweat from getting into the fabric. And he's taken this to its logical extreme and created this new kind of decadent, pleasurable interior out of the car itself. But again, it's like, it's provisional and it's making do in the same way. That suggests that we maybe had less to work with than we did before. moving quickly on now to soft Baroque. I think there's a kind of overlap here in the work of Joshua Gardner and Sasha Stuchin, who are also looking for this sense of delight, but it's a delight of little means with them. So this is a fountain they designed, but it's made of people, and they're all operating these different components of the waterworks. But I mean, soft Baroque's work also is asking other questions that speak really clearly to the contemporary moment, which have to do with their obsession with surfaces, which we typically see as being superficial and kind of categorically so, understandably so. But actually, surfaces and veneers are so much a part of architecture now. And architecture itself has become a kind of image, which is itself another kind of surface. So what they've done here is they've taken Enzo Mari furniture, this kind of self-built template furniture, and painted it blue and then created a kind of screen effect on a video monitor so that when you look at the furniture on the screen, you can kind of infinitely change its surface. And it reminds me a bit of poets like John Ashbery, who has this poem called Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror. And what he's insisting on in that poem is that the surface is what's there, and nothing can exist except what's there. And I think designers like soft Baroque are really subscribing to this faith in the surface as a serious and communicative component of design. They also work with readily available materials, producing these often quite uncomfortable alterations to them, exposing their hollowness in a way. This is hollow formed aluminum. And then they work with these very industrial materials as well. This is Kevlar that was bought on Alibaba and hot molded into a vase. And I think this kind of dexterity, this kind of willingness to use whatever is to hand to make work is what really excites me about their practice. And then finally, Theodor Meyer, who again is working in the same vein. He's an architect and scenographer, furniture maker, and will often design exhibitions for artists. And in this exhibition on the left, what he's done is he's spoken to a brick manufacturer who he discovered were laying pavers on a site nearby the gallery. And he agreed for them to sponsor the exhibition before the pavers were laid by donating temporarily the material to the gallery, which Theo then designed and organized to make these tables and chairs and podiums out of. So after the exhibition was over, the company picked up the pavers and laid them in the street. And there's something so ephemeral about that process, but incredibly rigorous as well, incredibly designed and incredibly formal. And again, this is something to do, I think, with this relationship between attitude and form, that you can still manifest a formal project while acknowledging all kinds of constraints, be they environmental or otherwise. Another project by Theo, which is my notes for. This is important. I might just have to go. Yeah, so this is a project for another artist. He's made a kind of loft in the hangar space that was available, where the client could sleep but also work. And in the foreground, just coincidentally, is a sculpture by this Belgian artist named Panamarenko. You know, other people have written about his work, Panamarenko's work, this funny little airplane, being a kind of, I'm just going to quote this curator named Yan Wu to explain that the moment that I look at an airplane, normal airplane, I don't believe that it can fly. But the moment I look at a Pan-Marenko airplane, I believe it can fly. And there's something so interesting about the communicative potential of design in that regard that reminded me, just going back to literature for a moment, to the writer William H. Gass, who was at this fiction festival in Cincinnati in the 80s, and he was talking to a real hardcore realist writer who was criticizing Gass's work, saying that the difference is that my 707 will fly. My form of literature will fly. It's realist literature. And Gass's, is too encrusted with gold to get off the ground. And then Gass responded, there was always that danger, but what I really want to have is to sit there. What I really want is to have it sit there, solid as a rock, and have everybody think it's flying. And I feel like this is Theo's work as well, which is always flickering between scales and always suggesting very imaginatively other objects, whether it's a house or a table or something else entirely. And it's the kind of attitude towards design that influences on Theo, including Ettore Sottsass also engaged with. There's a story of Sottsass convalescing in the hospital room. There's a stack of pills beside his bed. And in his imagination, the pills are stacked and become a totem, which he drew. And then that totem was then transformed into a pepper mill, which he built. But it's all of these different scales, and it's very much embedded in the imaginary, but made real somehow. So there's a kind of playfulness in the work that you could describe as part of this postmodern cohort that I find really exciting. And then finally from Theo, this is a project at Horst in Vilvoorde, which is a park in northeast Brussels. And it's an annual music festival that commissioned architects to design infrastructure and stages for. And last year, Theo and a collective called Stand by Zenken designed these series of podiums that would invite other artists and architects and designers to exhibit their work on. And the podiums themselves are actually readily available industrial objects, or these giant concrete tubes that are used in construction. But there's still this kind of, I don't have more pictures of it, there's still this real rigor to the setting out of the scheme and to the design of it. And for that reason, a coherent authorship. It is Theo, it is Stad van Zanken as a collective, but it allows for more voices as well, which I find really interesting. And maybe this is another one of these polarities that I find designers and architects struggle with today, that with this increased degree of collaboration and authorship, the design coherence tends to diminish somehow. And I think in Theo's work and Stad van Zanken's work, there is evidence of some alternative. So I'm not a designer anymore. I used to practice architecture, but the work I do now is geared more towards teaching. And there's this kind of long-standing question of what style should we build? And I think it stands to reason that we're asking this about teaching as well. And I just want to quickly share one studio I've been teaching recently at the RCA as kind of evidence of how I learn from these conversations and then embed that work in the studio as well. So I know we're running out of time, but I think I should make this quick. I mean, I've been teaching since 2019, always in a way accidentally. There's always been some kind of gap and a need to step in. And in fact, that's the case even now, teaching here with Alex and Catherine. Catherine's on mat leave, and I happen to be free and I'm filling in for her. So in a way, all of these years have been kind of provisional odyssey through academia, not necessarily entirely belonging in it. But for the most recent studio I've been teaching with my teaching partner, Kathy Hawley, we've been looking at this idea of excess and reuse and asking questions of considering how questions of pleasure and comfort can be overlooked when architecture success is increasingly determined by empirical measure, be it decarbonization, material provenance, or thermal performance. And of course, like reuse is conservative. I mean, you're supposed to keep as much as you can, right? But the more we contend with and maintain the existing, the more we become, in a way, inured to new possibilities. So the studio this year was all about trying to loosen students up and accept that we must work with what's around us and what's existing, but that we can still design and author work as well. Yeah, so looking at comfort, looking at traditional ways of teaching architecture that involve a lot of movement and embodied experience, and art that does the same. And even people like the Smithsons who have this very quaint but moving depiction of the small pleasures of life. I think somehow in architecture school, this escapes us a bit, and we forget about designing for comfort. And of course, Jenks and Silver's ad hocism is at home here too. So we had the students start by joining a ceramic studio and actually working with clay, which seems unusual, but it's also like the most kind of primal, the most direct way of designing with your hands, making all these kind of bizarre, exuberant objects. And then we actually had Theo and Sam and Barbara, who's Sam's working partner, into the studio to design furniture with the students. So we had this furniture making workshop out of cardboard, which was shown in a half-term show. And then finally, we had students enroll in life drawing sessions, drawing the human figure. These all seem like strangely traditional forms of learning about design and architecture, but they were totally refreshing. And the idea was that they would unlock a certain ambition or excitement amongst the students to start to produce work that went beyond the kind of merely making do when it comes to reuse. And then we went to Barcelona to see work from the likes of Gaudi and Jujol and many others. And there's a kind of tradition here as well of making a lot of a little. And this is an old converted barn that through some paint and very simple geometrical moves becomes a very strange, expressive, exuberant, imaginative environment. And I mean, this brings me to the very end of the talk, I guess, which is the last practice that I've spoken with most recently, that I'm really excited to reflect on and share more with you. And it's Summa Cum Femina, who are based in Leipzig and designed the German pavilion at last year's Venice Biennial. And you can see already, so Jujol on the left, Summa Cum Femina on the right. For the German pavilion, which didn't have a ramp, they designed one and built it with a group, but then also painted it the same marble color as the pavilion itself. So this is kind of commitment to expression and kind of coherent, singular sense of authorship that's coming through in these very strange, seemingly frivolous, but entirely necessary details. So there's the entrance before. And what they designed was basically like a material warehouse, which became raw material for people in a workshop to use to produce new objects. They also designed a fleshless toilet and took care of all the feces and took it out to a field and planted a new productive garden. And I mean, there's not a lot of time to go into this, but this seems so important that they're venturing into a kind of a realm that seems like it's beyond architecture, but in fact is integral to it. And they're looking at ideas that maybe we can get into the questions and answers. But this is the domain of the architect as much as the kind of the ramp in the front of the building. And Yeah, so architecture students were invited in to use what's around them to make new, in this case, doors that would then be shipped to spaces in Venice that needed them. I know there's some to go into this, but there's a kind of usefulness and practicality here, but also a sense of a real strange kind of exuberance and flamboyance in the kind of details that are being developed with these new techniques. And a new aesthetic almost altogether, which is born out of what's existing, what's around. But it's a kind of authored project nonetheless. And the workshop becomes a space of real communal activity and exchange amongst designers in a way, again, that I feel like we're kind of missing in the studio now, where we're very much isolated and focused on our own projects, which are often about ourselves and are very biographical. And I think for me, there's a real excitement around opening up the studio to be a much more collaborative space of exchange. This is the final slide, really. It's one of their most recent schemes built project called San Remo, which is a communal housing project that does very strange things to the domain of each occupant, allowing for this ongoing negotiation of who belongs where. And the fact that it's actually been built, to me, suggests that there's a whole new horizon of possibility when it comes to not only collective action, but collective living that people like Suma Kamfema are exploring. So that was a lot, too much probably. But in the little time we have left, I guess, how much time do we have left?
As much time as you would like to give, but
Okay,
30 minutes.
30 minutes.
No more than 30 minutes.
Okay. I mean, I think it would be more interesting to have a conversation now, because I find it easier to think in response to something or in collaboration with someone than I do being up here on my own. But how does this read to you as students? Was there anything that seemed particularly true or particularly relevant, or on the other hand, things that didn't quite land?